Starting off this unit of American history, um, we really have to start with the discovery of the New World. But before that, I want to go over 8 different paintings that are in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol building. And we're going to look at these as important moments that in the 1800s, mid 1800s, the leaders of our nation believed these moments were important enough to permanently memorialize in our center of government. So first we have the landing of Columbus in 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. This one's obvious because without Columbus stumbling upon the New World, almost as it were, our country could not exist. Then we have the discovery of the Mississippi River by further Spanish explorers. You can see in the image that the Spaniards look like a mass of people. We do have um, some monks, some missionaries in the bottom right-hand corner that they are establishing Christianity in this new land, but also the interaction with the natives at the sort of in the center of the picture. We see natives sort of cowering in fear. And the Mississippi, of course, is incredibly important to our nation's history because of the trade and travel it will make possible. Then we have in the early 1600s the baptism of Pocahontas. We all know Pocahontas from the Disney movie, and she doesn't end up with John Smith, which we'll talk about in a moment. But a native choosing to become a Christian. And we see that she and the priest are dressed in white for purity. But again, we have some other images within this painting. We see in the foreground on the right-hand side a couple natives. This includes her uncle, who several years later would ultimately attack the settlers in Jamestown. And you can see there, it almost looks like he is sulking or brooding, or perhaps he is planning his attack on these intruders. Next, we have the embarkation of the Pilgrims. When the Pilgrims arrived in the New World on the Mayflower, we see here what is important to them. At the center of the image, we have the Bible. These were religious men and women coming to find religious freedom. If you see on the left-hand side of the painting, there is a rainbow, which of course from the time of Noah has symbolized God's promise. So these believers are coming to a new world with the hope that and the faith that God will provide for them in these challenges. Then we have the Declaration of Independence, of course, very famous image here. We have the 5 writers of the Declaration of Independence presenting it to the Second Continental Congress. The importance here is obvious. The Declaration of Independence really is one of our foundational documents. Then we have the surrender of General Burgoyne at the Battle of Saratoga. We will talk in this unit about how important it was as the Battle of Saratoga as a turning point in the Revolutionary War. Next, we have the surrender of General Cornwallis. This, again, is at the end of a major battle, which will ultimately signify the end of hostilities between these two armies. Finally, we have the image of General Washington resigning his commission as commander of the army. Because from here, Washington will have a break of a few years, but then he will become our first president. And even in the mid-1800s, this was seen as symbolic enough to memorialize forever in our Capitol building. Again, you see the shaft of light, almost as if Washington has been ordained by God in an unofficial sense. Not like the kings of Europe had divine right and felt that they were chosen by God, but this is in a sense showing that religious background to our country. But before we talk to any of those, before we talk about any of those, we do need to talk about some of the basics. How did people get to this new world? And the commonly accepted method would be what we call the Beringia Land Bridge, or where the Bering Strait is. This was believed to be sort of grassed over glaciers, possibly up to 600 miles wide. And it would have been these massive grasslands where people would have lived. It was not only a way to move from Asia to North America, but people would have been settled there. As the Ice Age is ending, possibly 12,000 to 20,000 years ago, that's not as important, but as the Ice Age is ending and water levels start rising, the people settled there have to choose to go to Asia or go to North America. Genetically, these people who crossed at the Beringia Land Bridge are most likely genetically connected to the Native Americans, or if you're in Canada, the First Peoples or First Nations. It's probably likely that these people were following the seasons and following the food. They would be generally nomadic. They would become more effective at hunting as they created new tools. But what really is going to change life for them is the domestication of crops. And that will take them from being nomadic to settling in settlements, in putting down roots. The crop that is probably most important for these people is maize, which is incredibly close to modern corn. As you can see here in this image, the sort of natural or wild maize, very, very small kernels. As it is domesticated and different strains are combined together to make a more effective plant, if you look at the image on the right side, that corn is much larger, and that means that you're going to be able to produce more food, which means you can survive longer. Once domestication of crops begins, you really are going to have permanent settlements. You're going to have towns, and there are remnants of these dwellings all over North America. Many of them are mounds. The mound societies, we are not entirely sure, but it is believed that the mounds were used for religious ceremonies or possibly burials. But we're seeing a shift from nomadic people to finally creating establishments and cultures. There are 4 regions where we will see Native Americans or Indians as they play out in our study of U.S. history. In the Southwest, this is going to be groups like the Hopi or the Pueblos, and they are known for these sort of cave dwellings or these stone dwellings. Then in the Southeast, there are going to be the tribes like the Creek, the Cherokee, or the Choctaw. They are most closely related to those mound building societies that we just spoke about. In the plains, tribes like the Lakota, the Apache, the Cheyenne, and the Comanche, they were more nomadic, probably semi-nomadic, we would say, and they are closely related, closely tied to the buffalo. And so their dwellings, the teepee, would have been easy to set up and take down as they traveled along with the buffalo. And finally, in the Northeast, we have tribes like the Huron, the Algonquin, the Ottawa, and the Iroquois League. And their dwellings would have been more like long houses. And you can see that each of these groups and these various tribes, they are adapting to the geography. They are adapting to their surroundings, and their societies and the way they've set up their settlements will reflect that. All right, so we know who is in North America. We now have to talk about how the Europeans get to North America. Some of the first Europeans are going to be the Vikings. Their purpose in exploring the coastline of North America really is just to find supplies, to plunder and pillage as they had done with much of Northern Europe. There are also reports of Irish missionaries coming in the 800s in order to find the Garden of Eden. We know, of course, they didn't find it, but there has been evidence that there were people from Ireland around that time, or at least hundreds of years before other European settlers. Now, with the Moors, they didn't necessarily come to the New World, but their innovations with seafaring, as well as their involvement in Spain, will ultimately lead to Columbus coming to the New World. The Moors had taken over Spain way back around the year 700, and it is finally in the 1400s, Ferdinand and Isabella, who marry, unite their kingdoms, and they want to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula, reconquer Spain for the Spanish, so to kick the Moors out. Ferdinand and Isabella are gung-ho on this process of reconquering Spain for the Catholics. And then they take it a step further. They want to conquer new territories for the glory of Spain as well as the glory of the Christian faith. And that is why they send Christopher Columbus to find a route to the Indies, where he will get incredible wealth. He gets lost, he lands in Hispaniola, and then we have the Columbian Exchange, where now, even though it was a mistake, we have products coming to Europe from the New World, as well as things coming to the New World from Europe, things like horses and wheat and domesticated sheep, all of which will play a role now in North American history. But again, there are not as positive things that end up being exchanged. And what this also demonstrates is the importance of the oceans. Here we have, the oceans take up so much of our planet. And in the 1400s, we learn many lessons. From Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer, we learn that even if you're a tiny country like Portugal, that having a navy can give you power. The Portuguese ended up settling ports, along the coast of Africa in order to have some refueling posts to get to India. And there they would get spices and other crops, and that's how they made an incredible amount of wealth. And so we learn from the Portuguese that by controlling the seas, you can control your wealth. From Columbus, here in the pink route, we learn that oceans, even though they are vast and sometimes terrifying, they can actually be a carrier to new places and new products rather than a barrier. With all of these people, with all of these stories, there's the question of push or pull. Were they pushed to explore or were they pulled to explore? You could say there's a little bit of both in each of these cases. Columbus certainly was pulled back by the lure of riches, but he was also pushed by the goal of spreading Christianity. Then a little further north, especially with Europeans, the possibility of new land is incredibly enticing, because for centuries, if you owned land, it meant that you had wealth. And so this is going to be a pull for many Europeans to come to the New World. For the Europeans that we associate sort of as the first Europeans to create these settlements, the Pilgrims, and we'll talk about that later, but the Pilgrims, they were fleeing, they were being pushed out by religious persecution. You could say that they are pushed out of their home countries by religious persecution, or perhaps they are being pulled by the possibility of religious freedom. It depends on how you want to explain it. As time continues on, we will see that economic pressure will also be a push for some people to leave their homes. And a pull could possibly be social mobility, the possibility to change your social status. All of this is possible only because Columbus was able to break down the barrier of the Atlantic Ocean. And again, the Columbian Exchange, I cannot overstate enough how radical this was. All of these products that come to the New World sugarcane, bananas, wheat, rice, barley, oats, cattle, sheep, horses, as well as all of the diseases, coffee beans, things that are so important to modern economies in the Western Hemisphere, wouldn't have been possible without Columbus and the Columbian Exchange.